tonight for folks who haven't been here in person, so I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists again. Immediately to my right is Anna Simon, a reporter with the Greenville News for many years. She has received prizes from the South Carolina Press Association, and she has written a book entitled Kimberly's Flight, the story of Captain Kimberly Hampton, America's first woman combat pilot killed in battle. To her right is James Scott, no stranger to Spartanburg since he is a Wofford College graduate, an award-winning writer and investigative reporter for the Post and Courier, and he authored 3 books. The one that has just come out is Target Tokyo. Okay, that's my tongue twister for tonight. About the Doolittle Raiders. Okay. And finally, Mark Sibley-Jones, who is now a teacher of English at the Governor's School for the Arts. We were all talking about what a cool job that must be. But he taught for many years at USC Columbia's Honors College. And he is the author of By the Red Glare, about the Civil War in Columbia, South Carolina. And so I'm going to start with some questions for all of you. And my first question, and anybody can go first. Why war? And what is it that attracted you to writing about war or about your topic? Maybe it wasn't war itself that attracted you initially.
Must be ladies first. Am I talking into this loudly enough? A little more? Got better? I probably got into this very differently than the 2 gentlemen here. As a reporter, I did cover the death of Kimberly Hampton from Easley. A lot was written about her. There was a lot of press literally all over the world. I spent about a week very close to her parents as they went through the various steps of the news hitting all the way through to the funeral. They called me, actually they emailed me. It was a year or 2 later. They said, we would like to write a book. There's been a lot of publicity. She was a stellar individual. There was a lot written about her. Some of it was accurate, some of it not so. And they wanted an accurate record of her life. They also wanted a book that could be inspirational for any parent who has lost a child, regardless whether it is in war or regardless, to learn from their walk, and asked if I would work with them. So I really had to learn a lot about the 82nd Airborne. As a reporter, I was still working at the Greenville News. I hadn't retired yet when I wrote this. Just got on the phone and started making calls and asking questions, and really discovered this whole new world with the 82nd Airborne and the Army that is just filled with really amazing people.
Thank you. I'm James Scott. I've got Target Tokyo, which just came out, as Melissa noted. I was a military reporter for Post and Courier for a number of years, covering Iraq and Afghanistan, and so my interest really grew out of that. As to why I write about war now, it's inherently dramatic. And if you're looking to tell powerful stories and you're going to grip readers and pull them through a 300-page book, nothing is more dramatic than fighting. The lives of individuals are at stake. The lives of nations are at stake. And so I think it's just, and war also brings out the best and it brings out the worst in people and in nations. I like to say that it's, the best stories are the ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, and that happens frequently in combat. As for the Doolittle Raid, I think one of the things that appealed to me about telling that specific story was that on the one hand, it was a story about a single mission, 16 hours, 80 volunteer men who climbed into the back of 16 B-25s on a one-way mission to bomb Japan and escape to China. But it was a much greater story than just that one mission. It was a symbolic operation that was planned at the top levels of the government by Roosevelt at the time, who recognized after the attack on Pearl Harbor that it was going to take the United States the better part of 1942 to enlist and train the troops, build the ships, build the planes, the bullets, the rifles. But yet, he knew that the patriotism that flared up in the days after the attack on Pearl Harbor would be short-lived. And he needed some way, some symbolic gesture, if you will, to assure the American people that in the end we would win, that we would pull through and we would be victorious. And that's really what is the symbolic weight behind the Doolittle Raid. And so I think that's what appealed to me in that specific story was, on the one hand, it is the story of this amazing operation, this retaliatory strike against the Japanese, against the heart of their empire for the attack on Pearl Harbor. But it's also really the story of a nation, and the story of a mission in which the hopes and fears really of the nation really rested upon that.
Okay, for me, two provocations. Number one, in 2010, the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, the state newspaper, Columbia, had a 10 or 11 series piece on the beginning of the Civil War. And of course the secession started with Columbia, South Carolina. And so when the articles came in, I found, did anybody read those articles, by the way, in the state newspaper? Remember that 4 years ago? Well, never mind. I read it. Really interesting, intensely interesting, and I got more and more fascinated with those stories. They were 4 or 5 pages in length in the state newspaper on Sunday, every Sunday, once a month. Second factor, at the time I was teaching English in the Honors College at USC, and my office was on the Horseshoe. Now in 1862, I'm going to tell you why later on, why 1862, but in 1862, the University of South Carolina, or called back then South Carolina College, was constituted by what boundaries? The Horseshoe, that's all it was, the Horseshoe, okay? So my office was 2 doors down from the South Caroliniana Library, and every day after teaching, I would go down to the library and do research, and I got more and more drawn into Columbia's involvement in the Civil War. So that's how the story began. Okay. Next question.
Next question. More books have been written about war than any other topic, and I think war is a particularly popular topic among American audiences. Why do you think we are so drawn to reading about war?
I feel totally unequipped to answer the question, except perhaps through my personal experience, because now my mom served in the Army during World War II, my dad served in the Navy, but I did not grow up with stories of World War II. They were there for the war ended, and they regrouped and went about their normal lives. Learning about why people choose to join the military, learning about the dedication, the devotion, the patriotism of these people, just absolutely was inspiring. It's the only word for it. It was just inspiring. And as each person I interviewed, because I talked to about 50 people that knew Kimberly, most of them in the military, some of her early life, but most of them in the military, and listening to them talk about their individual part in what was going on. She served in Korea, she served in Afghanistan, and then she served in Iraq. She was a captain. She was at Fort Bragg and did training a couple of different times at Fort Rucker. I wanted to know, because she was a paratrooper, what does it feel like to jump out of an airplane? I called someone at Fort Rucker, I called a public information officer and said, can I talk to someone who can tell me? And a fellow got in touch with me and talked to me about what it's like when you're making that first jump. He said there's no atheists on that airplane. But I'm just in awe of the dedication and what our military does.
I have no idea why people are so drawn to write about war. I know why I am and why I'm interested in it. And I think it has a lot to do, I focus mostly on World War II, which, even today, after having written several books and spent the better part of the last 8 or 9 years researching it, it's just the size and the scope of it, and to think that literally at one point, just the United States had more than 10 million men and women in uniform. But more than anything else, I think one of the things that I find fascinating about it, I'm working on a book now on the Battle for Manila, which is February 1945, and it was when Douglas MacArthur returned to carry out his promise of "I shall return." And what they thought was going to be a very easy battle turned into one of the greatest slaughters of World War II. The troops fought in people's backyards, they fought in city parks, they fought in people's living rooms. And in the end, 100,000 civilians were killed. And it led to some of the worst atrocities in World War II since the rape of Nanking. And it's a story that has largely been forgotten. And so I've been spending the last year going through these war crimes depositions, about 30,000 pages of these victims who survived it. And it kind of reminds me of that great quote that from the Civil War that General Sherman said. He said, "War is cruelty." And I think when you look at war and you look at the capability and the barbarism of what people can do to one another, it's a lot like stopping on the highway to look at a car wreck. And I think there is a certain sense of fascination of like, how do these things happen? And how do countries get to the point where they engage in this level of warfare? How do soldiers interact on an individual, man-to-man kind of level like that as well? And so I think for a lot of people, there's an inherent interest in that. I know that's what I find fascinating looking at. So I can't speak for why other people do. I just know that for me as an individual, that's one of the things that draws me to it. You look at World War II and you think, 70 years ago. It's a long time ago. It's almost a century. But at the same time, it's within my own father's lifetime. And to think of the atrocities that happened in Germany, that happened in Asia, these were by people who are within our contemporaries of people we know. And I find that stuff fascinating.
I don't know why we're interested in war. I think the answers that have been given so far are about as good as we can find. We are fascinated by it, but we're also terrified by it. The history of writing, particularly in the Western world, begins with inquiry into the nature of war. Melissa, you know this better than anybody. The first historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, were writing histories. They were writing histories of warfare. Homer writes about warfare. So from the dawn of our writing history, this has been the subject that has most captivated us. Again, it's terrifying, it's horrible, and there are moments of absolute splendor, moments of great valor. Every time I talk about this, I get angry. I was going to use some language that I better not use. We have some fine young men in this room. The politicians who talk about how much they care about the military. Every one of them, right? Every politician in America talks about how much he loves the military and wants to defend America. What do you think they're doing when our soldiers come home wounded and beaten from war? I'll stop right there. Hypocrites, all of them. Don't believe a one of them. Can I say that, Melissa? I take it back. I shouldn't have said that.
Thank you, Mark. Often in writing, I find, whatever I'm reading, it is the unexpected or unusual detail that will give a piece of writing its power. And I wonder if you could talk about something that you found in your own research that you just seized upon and thought, oh, that's a real moment I need to focus on. Or is there something that you stumbled on? And how do you go about finding those unusual details that bring a story to life?
I think with mine, I was getting the personal stories of the people involved. Kimberly Hampton was very much loved by the troops that served under her and by the soldiers who went through training with her. She was ROTC battalion commander at Beasley High and Presbyterian College. So she was a leader before her feet ever left South Carolina soil. And so each person I interviewed about their years of sharing a bit of her life, about her, I was hearing their stories too. And so I had the opportunity to ask them, how did you feel? What did you think? What did you do? I think the most intense part for any of the people I interviewed, these were the people who served with her the day that she was shot down. There were two teams of two-seater helicopters each. They were taking turns. They were providing air cover for a raid on an illegal weapons market in Fallujah. And so the one team would be up, then they'd come down to refuel, and the next team would be up. And these were people who were very, very close, really, truly loved, respected each other. And suddenly, one helicopter's gone down. And they have got to find what happened, where is it, and try to get help there. And each of their stories just gave me chill bumps. Meanwhile, there were people back on the base who were alerted and ready to go. And again, this is a close, tight-knit unit, and those were the stories that just really were intense, because they're doing a job that they needed to do, but they're trying to find a helicopter that's down with two people in it that they loved and cared about as well.
Thank you. I write about World War II, and so the devil's in the details. And the details can be, one well-placed detail can tell you so much more when it comes to mental images. But a lot of it also is a historical scavenger hunt. If you are looking to tell the story, it's always better, I think, when I interview a lot of people who were in World War II and are veterans and are survivors. And their memory 70 years later isn't always as detailed as what their diaries were like, or their letters were like that they wrote at the time of the action. And so I compare what I do to it being a historical scavenger hunt. You go to the National Archives, you pull the deck logs, you pull the action reports, you pull the official records. And then you go to the individuals and you try to find those personal details that hammer out and flesh out them for an audience. And it's a scavenger hunt. I'll give you an example. I had this one guy who was an officer on the Silverside, which was a submarine I wrote about in my second book. And I was trying to track down crew members who'd been on board. I found an obituary. He had died in 1976, the year after I was born. But I found an obituary for him, and it had his son listed who lived in Maui. And so I, using various public databases, tracked down his son, called him up one day and said, look, your father's been dead now for almost 4 decades. I said, but, writing a book about the submarine, and I'm just calling on an off chance. Maybe he got the diary, maybe he got some letters, something. So I said, it's funny that you called. He said, about a year ago my mom died. And he said, right before my mom died, she gave me this box. And inside this box was all my father's wartime letters that I never knew he'd written. And she told me, she said, hang on to these. Someday somebody will want them. And so about a month later, the photocopies, 311 pages of these letters showed up on my doorstep. And they were the most amazing window into what it was like for these young American submarine sailors who were fighting out there alone all the way off the coast of Japan. Not only was it about what it was like to survive depth charges, but it was about the fact that they ended up with these 2 mice on board that had been, they called them stowaways, and they nicknamed them Romeo and Juliet. And then one day Juliet vanished, and they couldn't figure out what had happened. What had Romeo done? And then they realized that she'd been around the torpedo tubes right about the time of their last attack. And maybe she'd gone out the door. And so I think you're really looking for those kind of details. I'm working on this book now, as I mentioned earlier, on the Battle for Manila. And I'm writing this stuff about Santo Tomas, which is the largest civilian internment camp in Asia. And it's where all these businessmen, their wives, their children who were captured by the Japanese after the fall of Bataan and Korea were ended up. And they were systematically nearly starved to death. Many of them, in fact, did starve to death. And so I'm writing about starvation. What is it like to starve? And so I've been going through these diaries and these letters of these people who went through it. And in those final months before they were rescued, they ate the pigeons that they could capture, they ate the hibiscus that they could find. And they ate anything they could to survive. And one of the things I found in there is they were actually bartering 8 pesos for a rat. So even a rat was something that was worth paying 8 pesos for. And in another diary of one of these kids, he actually wrote that of the tastiest things that he'd been forced to eat, the tastiest thing was puppies, because they were tender. And so it's really, those are the kind of details you're looking for. If you want to know what it's like to starve, to eat anything, how much would you pay for a rat? Would you eat a puppy? And I think those are the kind of details that you're looking for to help for a reader at home who's looking through this book to understand what it was like to come that close to starvation.
All right, I have the answer, but I've forgotten the question.
The question was, how do you find that unusual detail?
Okay. I came to the story of the war circuitously. Okay, I was not initially fascinated by the war. Well, I was. But what initially hooked me was the understanding that in 1862, June 25th, 1862, the governor of South Carolina issued an order closing what was then called South Carolina College. 9 students remained in the college. 9 students. Everybody else had gone to war. Okay? Maximilian Laborde, who was the dean of students, that wasn't his title, but that was his role, wanted the college to remain open. And of course, if you're a college professor, you have an interest in keeping colleges open, and I certainly did, even historically. So that's what got me. That's the initial detail that drew me into the war's effect, specifically on the South Carolina College and Columbia's contribution to the war effort.
Mark, a question for you. One study I've seen says that over 50,000 books and pamphlets have been published about the Civil War. And then with the advent of the internet, there's hundreds of web pages, and there are hundreds of thousands, millions of pages of documents about the Civil War. It seems to me that even if you just want to narrow it down to Columbia, that the research and sorting through the research could be a daunting task. Where did you start?
That's a mean question. James said something even meaner. He said Wikipedia. That's not true. Don't you go there either, okay? Actually, I started with those newspaper articles, the state news articles, and then the South Carolina Library has just volume after volume, not only of the Civil War, but particularly on Columbia's involvement in that war, and very little. Pat Conroy made this observation, he's right about it, very little has been written about Columbia's involvement in the war. And so I had a plethora of material right there. I didn't have to go anywhere, 2 doors down. It is impossible to do all the research one could do on any momentous event like the Civil War. You simply have to stop. You have to say, this is as much as I can do, and this is my little contribution, here it is, and I hope you like it.
James, same question.
That's the beauty of deadlines. They make you stop. So, I think, the challenge is like Mark said, it's so voluminous. If you're writing about World War II, you have to pick those individual stories and focus on those stories I also think readers like to attach themselves to characters and smaller stories. If you read these just broad, sweeping books on World War II, they just become ultimately your eyes roll back in your head because it's numbers, it's nation names, it's battalions. But if you can focus in and tell the story of this one individual, like Jimmy Doolittle, this 45-year-old guy, who's 5'4", who's a former stunt pilot who gets the responsibility of having to lead this amazing one-way mission to bomb Tokyo, readers can attach themselves to that individual, and they can go along on this adventure with them. And I think as a writer, you're looking for that way to be able to, to pull them into that. And I think characters are a great way to do that. And that happens by going not at the 30,000 foot level, but at the 30-foot level in your storytelling.
Anna, in 2014, war veteran and novelist Kara Hoffman published an op-ed in the New York Times in which she argued that war narratives have always been and continue to be dominated by male voices, from the Greek classics to modern writing about war. And she says that stories of women at war are nearly absent from our culture. How do you think that writing about war from a female perspective is different?
I think the reason that this book was published was because an agent I had wanted to prove that point. I talked about calling Fort Bragg public information officer saying, I'm a writer, I'm doing this, and I want to find out I need to know what it feels like, what it's like to jump out of an airplane with a parachute strapped to you. And so he hooked me up with the person I needed to talk to, but he also said, there's a writer named so-and-so that's written a lot of books about the 82nd Airborne. Would you like to talk to him? Maybe he can help you with your project. Of course. Called him, explained to him what I was working on. He said, my agent is looking for more contemporary, looking for authors who are writing about more contemporary wars. Most of what she had, and it is a female agent, most of what she had handled was World War II. She had started with writing stories of her relatives who had participated in World War II, and she was working with a lot of the veterans, helping them get their stories down, but she wanted to get into something more contemporary. Great, I said, I'll call her. Well, when she got my call, she got very excited. Not only were we talking about a more contemporary war, but she said, I have been trying to explain to the publishers. She specializes in military books. She said, I've been trying to explain to the publishers that there is a new audience. There are a lot of women who serve the military. It is not just a male audience. And when she took the book out, the first two queries she sent or the first two publishers she contacted, one of those two publishers was interested. They had just published their very first book and this casemate, my publisher, they had just published their very first book by a female author. And she had served in Iraq, and her job was to help pick up the bodies and send them back here with respect. And I read her book, and oh my goodness, it's wonderful. But there are many, many women in the military today, and many of the people I interviewed were women, many of them were men, but there are women's stories to be told, and there's obviously a need to tell them.
Well, I think it is time to take our break. I know our panelists want to get some of your questions, so